I kept hearing about a certain sci-fi novel that the internet has been obsessing over for years actually, so I'm very late to the game. But through all of the internet comments and reviews, I discovered that the book is essentially about a bromance between a quirky middle school teacher and a rock. Naturally, I had to see what all the fuss was about, so I read the book. Then I actually kept hearing a bunch of rave reviews about the recent movie adaptation that was released earlier this year, so I watched that too. Now that I'm familiar with both versions, I definitely have some thoughts. Some people review books, some review movies. I like to review books that became movies. And if you haven't met me yet, my name is Hannah. Today I will be talking about Project Hail Mary. Now, I will be rating both the book and the movie, so if you stick around till the end, I will let you know which one I liked more. Also, fair warning, there will be spoilers, so please proceed with caution. Project Hail Mary was written by Andy Weir, the same author behind The Martian, and was originally published in 2021. This was my first time reading anything by Weir, so I didn't really know what to expect going into it. One thing I noticed almost immediately about his writing style is just how technical it is. He doesn't appear to be particularly interested in prose or lyrical descriptions. Instead, he focuses heavily on science and problem solving. At least in this book, since I can't speak to any of his other works. Now, personally, I don't mind that style of writing, but if you're not someone who's interested in math or science or detailed explanations of how things work, some parts of this book may actually be a little difficult to get through. But if anyone needs a quick refresher, Project Hail Mary follows Dr. Rylan Grace, who wakes up alone on a spaceship with no memory of who he is or why he's there. Now, just to preface, in the novel, he is commonly referred to as just Grace, so I will be also referring to him as Grace from now on. Anyway, as Grace's memories gradually return, he recalls that Earth is currently facing an extinction-level crisis caused by a mysterious microorganism called astrophage. And astrophage are extraterrestrial life forms that have evolved to essentially feed on and store energy from stars. The astrophage are able to use that stored energy to travel between stars and other planets along what they call a Petrova line in order to reproduce. So they sound like kind of cool little guys, right? Wrong. One of the stars that astrophage is feeding on is actually the Earth's sun, causing it to gradually dim. If nothing is done, the loss of solar energy will trigger a global ice age phenomenon, unlike anything humanity has ever experienced. Now, as someone that absolutely hates the cold, that already sounds horrible, but if it's not bad enough, the implications of this drop in temperature are crop failures, mass starvation, and essentially 80% of humanity becoming extinct. And because humans are such joyful creatures, there is also a very good chance that a major world war will break out over resources, so actually, everybody's doomed. However, humanity's only lead comes from Tau Ceti, a nearby star that appears unaffected by astrophage and this phenomenon. Fortunately, astrophage serve as an incredible energy source as they already cover large distances across space to just get it on. So they happen to be an incredibly powerful fuel source capable of making interstellar travel possible. Now, all of this is the reason that Grace finds himself on a desperate one-way mission to Tau Ceti in the hope of finding a solution before humanity runs out of time. And eventually, he discovers he is not actually alone in this. Not long after arriving to Tau Ceti, Grace encounters an alien spacecraft piloted by Rocky, an engineer from the 40 Eridani star system, who also appears to be alone, and his species faces the exact same astrophage problem. Now, I think all of that should have been enough to refresh your memories, but if you haven't read the book, I think you can at least gather where the story goes from here. At its core, this is a first contact story mixed with a Save Humanity space survival narrative. And because bits and pieces about the main character and the mission are gradually revealed in flashbacks, there is also a fair bit of mystery to the story as well. So it's a fairly familiar sci-fi premise, right? But what really makes Weir's story work is the combination of an intriguing doomsday scenario and the unlikely friendship that develops between two scientists from completely different solar systems. Technically, one of them is an engineer, not a scientist, but close enough. Because beneath all of the science jargon and problem solving, Project Hail Mary is really a story about isolation, emotional connection, and finding companionship in the most unlikely place. While human befriends alien isn't exactly a revolutionary sci-fi concept, something about this particular friendship still felt surprisingly fresh. And Mainly that was because of Rocky, our little Iridian rock dude. Rocky did a lot of the heavy lifting in the story and was easily the character I enjoyed reading about the most. A huge portion of my enjoyment came from simply learning more about him. I think Weir was extremely creative when it came to designing Rocky both as a species and as a character. I loved learning about Rocky's language, his culture, and even his alien physiology. Upon their first face-to-face encounter, Grace describes Rocky as a mix between a rock, hence the name Rocky, and a spider because he has 5 arms. But despite his likeness to an 8-legged creature most people have an aversion to, Rocky is actually really cute and endearing. He doesn't see the world the way humans do because he doesn't have eyes. Instead, he perceives his surroundings through a form of echolocation. And because Rocky can't see and has a completely different language, Grace and Rocky have a few misunderstandings at first. However, Grace develops a computer program to translate whatever Rocky says, and because Rocky has a near photographic memory, he picks up English pretty quickly. Once they get past the language barrier, they end up forming a pretty intriguing and compelling friendship. And that's because neither character can solve the story's problems on their own. Whenever Grace has a crazy idea or theory, Rocky can quickly determine whether it will actually work because he is incredibly good with numbers. When Grace needs a tool, a machine, or some impossibly specific piece of equipment, Rocky somehow always manages to make it. So what starts as a sort of symbiotic relationship where each character benefits from the other's intelligence and contributions to their shared mission develops into a much sweeter friendship. However, while reading about the two characters' dynamic, a lot of what I enjoyed about Rocky's character actually highlighted some of my issues with our human protagonist. In the book, Grace's character felt somewhat one-dimensional. I didn't necessarily dislike him, but compared to Rocky, I found him to be quite predictable and, unfortunately, pretty generic. Early on, we learn that Dr. Grace is an exiled scientist turned middle school teacher, a bit of a loner who constantly deflects stressful situations with jokes and sarcasm. He also happens to spend a large portion of the story panicking his way through situations during his mission. And while most of those traits make him feel quite human, it still felt like his personality was just a copy-paste of the male protagonist archetypes that I've seen in a lot of recent Hollywood blockbusters. In the book, a lot of Grace's personality comes through via his inner monologue, where he constantly makes jokes to himself. Sometimes that was okay, but other times it felt a little forced and a bit cringy. The bigger issue for me, though, is while Grace panics constantly, he somehow manages to come up with an idea to solve almost every problem. And because of that, after a while, a lot of the tension started to disappear because I never really believed he was going to fail. But my biggest issue of all with Grace really started when I realized he just had an unrealistic amount of knowledge. He has a doctorate in molecular biology, but somehow he can also do incredibly complex calculations in his head and adapt to being an astronaut with very few issues. So at a certain point, it started to feel less like he was a believable person and more like whatever kind of expert the story needed in that particular moment. Rocky never gave me that same feeling. Objectively speaking, Rocky might even be more capable than Grace. Rocky is described by Grace as the best engineer he has ever met. He is even better with math than Grace, and he has the ability to build almost anything from xenonite, an incredibly durable material made from xenon gas, that his species uses to build anything and everything, including his spaceship. But while Grace's scientific expertise sometimes felt like a very convenient invention throughout the story, Rocky's intelligence never really bothered me. Maybe that's because he's an alien and it's just easier to accept that aliens may be smarter than humans in certain areas, but his intelligence also serves an important purpose throughout the story. He is essentially Grace's intellectual equal. And I think that's a big part of why Rocky is so lovable. If Grace was the only character in this book, I think I would find him a little too irritating and just unbelievable, but I think Rocky makes Grace a more interesting character just by giving him someone else to bounce off of. Someone who is just as capable and intelligent. They create a dynamic where each character has immense respect for each other and their intelligence. They share knowledge with each other in the way that peers would, and they are both able to participate and contribute to solving problems or removing any kind of obstacle that threatens the success of their missions. And while Grace had jokes that I think were a little bit cringy at times, Rocky was also quite humorous in a very natural way, which I think created a little bit more of a balance. That actually leads into another one of my basic criticisms of the book. There were several moments where the story's commitment to scientific realism felt quite selective. Now, saying that a sci-fi novel isn't scientific enough may sound overly harsh. After all, every fictional story, science fiction or otherwise, requires the audience to suspend at least some amount of disbelief. And to be fair, Project Hail Mary is built around a giant fictional premise, astrophage. But that's not my issue. The issue that I have is that the novel seemed to present itself as a very scientific and technically rigorous story, yet there were several moments where the science felt less like science and more like narrative convenience. I don't want to repeat myself, but Grace is essentially a jack of all trades when it comes to anything science. And I'm actually someone that has a background in molecular biology, his supposed area of expertise, so I found that very difficult to believe. Now, I'm not just bringing up my scientific background to brag. I only have a bachelor's degree and my job is not science related at all. But essentially, scientists are highly specialized. Even brilliant researchers don't casually become experts in every other scientific field. Yet Grace seems capable of solving problems in whatever field the plot requires at any given moment. But this lapse in scientific realism doesn't stop just at Grace. The same thing applies to the mission itself. Humanity's survival depends on this one desperate long-shot mission, hence the name Hail Mary. Yet, when Grace wakes up alone with severe amnesia, there doesn't appear to be a single mission briefing, instruction manual, or even pre-recorded message to explain what's happened and what he's supposed to do. This makes for an entertaining story, but it doesn't exactly scream carefully planned interstellar mission. Instead, he has to slowly piece everything together through flashbacks, which unfortunately raises another one of my issues. The entire mystery plotline of the story begins when Grace wakes up from a medically induced coma with no memory of who he is. He forgets his name, where he's from, why he's in space, and the fact that Earth is currently facing an extinction-level crisis. What he doesn't forget, however, is science. Grace remembers scientific terminology, advanced mathematical concepts, how to suit up to go on a spacewalk, which he learned quite recently leading up to the mission, and pretty much every other piece of information he needs to survive. Then as the story progresses, the rest of his memories seem to return exactly when they're needed. I will give it to Weir, the amnesia and conveniently timed flashbacks are effective storytelling devices. They keep the mystery moving and allow the reader to uncover information alongside Grace. But they also just made the book feel a little too tidy. And there are plenty of other moments where the story's commitment to scientific realism seemed to bend whenever the plot needed it to. Now, all of these things don't make the book bad. They just made it harder for me to fully buy into the idea that this was the hard science novel it appeared to be marketed as. Overall, I actually found the story quite entertaining. It's fast-paced, easy to binge, and constantly introduces new problems that keep the story moving. But it did fall a little bit flat at times. In the end, I'll give this book a 6.5 out of 10. There is currently a drone in my backyard. I don't know if it's watching me. Okay. We continue because I am going to try to be professional. The video doesn't end here though, because after reading the book, I kept seeing glowing reviews about the movie adaptation that was just released earlier this year in March, and even a lot of my friends seem to really enjoy it. So after hearing everyone and their mom raving about the new Project Hail Mary movie, I went into it with very high expectations. In fact, after giving the book a 6.5 out of 10, I genuinely thought there was a chance I'd end up liking the film even more. After all, adaptations sometimes solve the problems in the source material, and I was also curious to see how the filmmakers would handle a novel that spends most of its runtime inside one man's head, explaining scientific concepts and walking through problems step by step. The answer, though, is that they mostly don't. In the movie, a huge amount of scientific detail, exposition, and problem-solving from the novel has either been removed or condensed. Now, to be fair, I do understand why. Film is a visual medium, and watching Ryan Gosling spend 20 minutes explaining astrophage reproduction or orbital mechanics would probably send most audience members into orbit.
There it is.
In some ways, the adaptation benefits from those cuts. The movie is undeniably more accessible than the novel. The pacing is faster, the story moves more smoothly, and viewers don't need a science degree to understand what's happening. The problem is that a lot of what was removed were things that made the book feel somewhat unique. The easiest way that I can describe the movie adaptation is that everything feels softer. The humor is broader, the emotional beats are more obvious, and the darker implications of the mission are toned way down. Even the problem solving feels less grounded in logic and process and more like magic. In the book, for all its flaws, there is at least an attempt to make every solution feel earned. So while Grace almost always has a solution for everything, we do generally spend pages with Grace and Rocky testing ideas, making mistakes, and working through problems. But the movie frequently skips straight to the solution. I think one of the best examples of this is the Talmiba storyline. In the movie, Rocky and Grace discover Talmiba, a amoeba-like life form in Adrian's atmosphere, which is a planet close by to Tau Ceti, and they quickly realize that Talmiba are natural predators of astrophage. Talmiba just so happen to be the solution to both of the crises that they face on their home planets. There's an issue though because Talmiba do not thrive in nitrogen, they actually immediately die, which is a problem because both of the planets that they need Talmiba to survive on have nitrogen in their atmospheres. So they have to basically set up breeding tanks and selectively breed Talmiba while gradually introducing nitrogen into their environments. That's a lot, I know, but unfortunately there is a moment in the book where the Talmiba escape and start eating through some of their fuel supply, astrophage, which Rocky actually donated to Grace so that Grace could go home. The movie skips most of this, removing the first Talmiba escape incident entirely and turning it into a much quicker leap from discovery to solution. The movie also skips over another important explanation, which is why the Hail Mary's crew needed to be placed in medically induced comas for the journey to Tau Ceti. In the novel, this is carefully justified. Humans can't safely coexist in confined spaces for long periods of time. In this case, the voyage to Tau Ceti is almost 5 years, without the risk of killing each other, so the crew is kept in stasis during the trip. However, there is a rare coma-resistant gene that Grace just happens to have, which is what makes him a uniquely suitable candidate for the mission in the first place, and ultimately leads to him being selected after the primary candidate and the backup both conveniently die.
Oops!
Now, once again, these omissions don't necessarily ruin the story, but they do start to add up. And unfortunately, a lot of this oversimplification also affects the characters too. Movie Grace feels less like an awkward, emotionally isolated scientist and more like a fairly generic Hollywood protagonist. He's louder, goofier, and behaves more like a frat bro. Not to say that scientists can't also be frat bros. Likewise, the Hail Mary's mission director, Strat, also loses a lot of what made her an interesting semi-villain in the book. In the novel, she's ruthless, pragmatic, and fully aware that history will probably judge her as a monster. She isn't trying to be liked, though, she's trying to save humanity. She's the ultimate utilitarian, if you will, and every decision she makes is based purely on survival regardless of moral cost. In fact, there is a moment in the book where she openly acknowledges that she'll likely end up in prison for all of the things that she authorized leading up to the Hail Mary's launch. Pardoning a convicted murderer, blowing up an iceberg to speed up global warming, the usual. But the movie softens her considerably. She becomes warmer, more approachable, and far more emotionally connected to the people around her. The karaoke scene is probably the clearest example. Bookstrat would absolutely not partake in karaoke because she would see it as wasting valuable time. But Movie Strat stands in front of the mission team singing Sign of the Times by Harry Styles, bonding with people she personally recruited for a mission. And that moment, more than anything, captures the difference between the two versions of her character. In the novel, Strat keeps everyone at arm's length because emotional attachment would only make her job harder. In the movie, she's kind of a pick-me. Now, for viewers who haven't read the book, the karaoke scene probably seems like a harmless character moment, but for readers, this just feels wrong. And it's not just Grace and Strat. The Hail Mary crew, specifically Yao and Ilyukna, are also treated very differently. In the book, long before he remembers their names, there's already a sense that they mattered to him and that he truly cared about these people. He just can't remember why at first. And in the book, we also watch Grace build relationships with Yao and Ilyukna through recovered memories. The film strips most of that away though, and we spend very little time with the crew and learn little to nothing about them beyond their willingness to join the mission and a little nugget about each of their personalities. As a result, they are treated much more as background information than actual characters, making their loss have less emotional weight. Now, once again, I do understand that the Hail Mary crew are smaller supporting characters, so they were never going to have a lot of screen time in the movie. But you're telling me that the crew have less runtime than this dude right here? I think he takes up maybe one chapter in the book. Rocky is also significantly different in the movie, but I'll come back to him later. All of the film's oversimplification is really my core issue with the adaptation. I can acknowledge that a lot of stuff from the book would have been cut from the movie regardless. I'm not just being cynical for the sake of it, but the movie consistently trims away scientific exposition and important character moments while adding entirely new material and extraneous scenes that don't really move the story forward. So ultimately, it keeps removing complexity to free up time for dudes just being bros. That's not inherently bad, but it does create a noticeable imbalance where a majority of time is spent on emotional shorthand and spectacle. Ultimately, it's not about runtime, it's about priorities. And depending on what you value more, that trade-off will land very differently. Now, the biggest change that the movie made, and the one I genuinely disliked the most, was Rocky's character. Rocky is still incredibly likable, but I think the adaptation fundamentally changes what makes Rocky special. In the book, Rocky isn't just Grace's friend, he's Grace's equal. And he genuinely cares for Grace. He donates a bunch of his astrophage to Grace to prevent him from dying on his own in space. And he saves Grace by sacrificing his own life and technically the survival of his own species. And all of this constantly reminds us that Rocky isn't a sidekick. The movie, however, seems far more interested in making Rocky cute. A lot of his scenes are played for comedy. Rocky's more excitable, more impulsive, more childlike. And while some of his on-screen moments are funny, they gradually shift the dynamic between the two characters. Instead of feeling like two brilliant individuals solving problems together, it sometimes feels like Grace is babysitting a space puppy. Harsh, but genuinely the best way I can describe it. Take Rocky moving into the Hail Mary. In the book, it's a practical decision that both of them make because working together simply makes sense. Grace can't go into Rocky's ship, but Rocky can go into Grace's ship. In the movie, though, Rocky basically barges in and announces, "I live here now." Or there's also the scene where Grace appears to be hiding from Rocky while recording a video diary.
Personal space is at a premium.
My kids will not leave me alone.
Or there's also the time that Rocky is super excited to show Grace how he eats. Now, individually, these scenes are harmless, but collectively, they totally reshape his character. Rocky is pretty comedic in the book, but it usually stems from cultural misunderstandings and communication barriers. The humor in the movie often comes from Rocky behaving like an annoying child. And that's actually a pretty meaningful difference, because one of Grace's defining traits in the book is that he struggles with adult relationships. Then he meets someone who understands him completely, someone equally intelligent, equally curious, and bingo, an adult. For perhaps the first time in the story, Grace finds a genuine peer, and that's why the friendship resonates. Not because Rocky is cute, not because he's funny, but because their relationship never felt one-sided. And I think ultimately the movie loses that. I just mentioned before that the movie cuts, in my opinion, important details, while also adding new material, so I thought I would also go over some of the added scenes as well. Not just the additions that I didn't like because I've already mentioned a lot previously, but there were actually some additions in the movie that I wasn't that bothered by. For one, I didn't mind the use of the video diaries. I don't know if that's going to be controversial, but I think that they're a pretty good storytelling device. I also didn't necessarily mind the ending where after Grace sends the beetles, the probes with all of his findings and the Talmiba back to Earth, we cut to Strat, also back on Earth, watching the video diary with Rocky. The book purposely left readers to their imaginations when it came to the fallout back on Earth, but I understand why the filmmakers included it. Some of the complaints I saw online about the book was that readers wanted to know more about what was happening on Earth during the Hail Mary mission. But that means that we as readers never really get the emotional payoff, whether the mission and all of the sacrifices that came with it were actually worth it. Personally, I thought this was a pretty harmless change that provided a bit more closure to general audiences. Another addition that I initially had mixed feelings about, but eventually just stopped caring, was Grace getting the chance to enter Rocky's ship as part of their farewell presents. Now, I do want to be clear, I didn't hate this scene, but I didn't particularly like it either. In the book, there is absolutely no way Grace could step foot inside Rocky's ship. The gravity, atmospheric pressure, and extreme temperatures would basically crush and cook him at the same time. It's one of the many ways the novel emphasizes just how fundamentally different their worlds are. However, the atmosphere and environmental conditions of Arid aren't really discussed in the movie to the same extent they are in the book, so most moviegoers would have no reason to know that Grace physically shouldn't be able to enter Rocky's ship. And honestly, don't lie, if you read the book, you were curious about what the inside of Rocky's ship looked like too. To me, this change feels like harmless fan service. Now, I feel like I can't get into my final thoughts without mentioning a few more things about the movie that just kind of annoyed me. Firstly, Grace is supposedly this brilliant scientist, yet somehow doesn't know that you're meant to balance a centrifuge. Secondly, after the Talmiba escape for a second time because they have evolved to slip through Xenonite, Grace realizes that Rocky will never make it back to Arid to save his planet. Grace decides to finally grow a spine and turns the Hail Mary around to save his alien best friend. However, the movie never really explains how Grace manages to find Rocky and his derelict ship again. But finding Rocky again without any calculated plan or strategy should be nearly impossible because space is unimaginably huge. Finding Rocky's ship should be like trying to find a needle in a haystack that extends infinitely in every direction. I could definitely keep going, but I do think I am done ranting for now. So, what's my final verdict? Well, I didn't hate the book or the movie, but I also didn't love either of them. Overall, I found both versions pretty entertaining, yet ultimately a little disappointing, with the movie definitely being the bigger letdown of the two. To me, it kind of felt like the movie was made for kids. I love kids' movies, I just wasn't expecting that from this particular movie. The movie took a character that I already found somewhat bland in the book and somehow made him even less interesting. And not only less interesting, but occasionally downright annoying. It also took an extremely intelligent, fascinating alien engineer and simplified him into something that sometimes felt closer to Groot than the Rocky I imagined while reading. Overall, I felt like a lot of the new material added by the film was unnecessary and occasionally undercut the isolation, uncertainty, and problem solving that made parts of this novel work for me in the first place. With all of that said, I would probably give the movie a 5 out of 10. Reading the book first, I think definitely dampened my experience with the movie because I spent so much time noticing what had been removed. And I don't even think that a movie adaptation has to be an exact replica of the book to be good. That said, I'm genuinely glad that both the book and the film have resonated with so many people. Science fiction is one of my favorite genres because it has the ability to explore enormous ideas while still telling deeply human stories. At its best, it can make us think about science, morality, survival, and what it means to connect with someone completely different from ourselves. If you read the book or watched the movie, let me know which one you preferred in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe because I want to keep making videos just like this one. Thank you so much for watching. Bye!